Welcome to Hierarchy of Value Contrasts. I'm Charles Bernard, and I am a professional paperback book cover illustrator who founded the Online Art Academy, where you learn the elements of picture making, which are the fundamentals. With this video, you'll learn how to establish a hierarchy of value contrasts, which is part of composition. For any drawing or painting to be successful, a knowledge of composition needs to be applied. For without this knowledge, your work will remain at the amateur level. Composition, as well as design, makes the crucial difference between a beginner's work and a professional's work. I'm going to show you what to do when you have shapes that have the same value, but you want the viewer's eye to be attracted to one particular shape more so than to the others that have the same value. So, for example, let's say within the painting there is this light shape, and then there's another light shape, or let's say they're white. They're white shapes. All of these are white shapes. So they all have the same degree of value contrast with their background. Although you look at the larger white shape first, let's say you want to attract more attention to the smaller white shape. That's the center of interest. The center of interest isn't always where the biggest shape is. Many times it's where the smaller shape is. But you want to keep all of the shapes the same white value. You don't want to draw attention to that smaller white shape by reducing the white to a darker value like I'm doing now. By doing that, more attention is directed toward the little white shape. But let's say you don't want to do that. You want those other shapes to be white as well, but you want to direct attention to that smaller white shape. So what do? Well, you have to increase the value contrast where that smaller white shape is by adding a darker value, such as I'm going to do now. Now, more attention is directed toward that white shape, that smaller white shape. Because of the darker value that I placed behind it, a stronger value contrast is created. Less attention is directed here toward these other larger white shapes, because here the value contrast isn't as strong. So in a painting where you want to keep a certain number of shapes all the same value, like a white or off-white value, but you want one of them to be more important so that the eye is directed more toward that smaller white shape. What you do is create a stronger value contrast there, while creating lesser value contrast at those other white shapes by not surrounding them with a darker value like you do for that smaller white shape like I did here. Now what does this look like in an actual painting? I'm going to do a quick, rough black and white sketch here to show you what that looks like. So first of all, you have to establish a dominant size. If you don't know composition, then it's very important that you learn composition. For without composition, you can't possibly be painting really great pictures. You may know all the tricky techniques that so many videos show you on how to paint the sky, how to paint rocks, how to paint trees, and so on. You may know all of those techniques, but if you don't know design and composition, then those techniques aren't going to do you much good. And what I'm showing you here is part of composition. So let's say I have these rocks here, and they're by the ocean. And up here on this rock, there's a lighthouse. So I'm just roughly sketching that in, as you can see. And now I'm going to add some tone, just as I did in this abstraction here. Get the color picker here and select a value. Start with this large rock here. Just rough it in. And then there's the rock over here in the corner, the right-hand side. Darken this rock on the left-hand side like that, and the one on the right as well. And then there's a dark rock over here also. And you can see that I'm doing this really quick. Darken that rock even more in the lower left here. And the one further back also. And then I'll add some shadow onto the lighthouse buildings there. And darker tone for the sky here. And I'll add a tone where the ocean is, right here. Like this, and there's a wave breaking on the rocks. So here's my really rough sketch, which I'm going to refine a little bit. So I'm going to jump ahead and show you what the more refined version looks like. So I refined the rough sketch a little bit more, not that much. Looking at this rough black and white sketch, you can see that I haven't added any white shapes yet, or very light shapes. And that's because I want to do that now and explain some things to you. So let's say there's a white shape in the front here, right there, where a wave is breaking up against these dark rocks, like this. Now the eye of the viewer is going to go here, because that's where the strongest value contrast is, just like in my example over here. However, in my example here, I also have other white shapes. So I need to add additional white shapes to this rough sketch here. And what I'm going to do is add a white shape to the lighthouse that you see, so that I end up with something that looks like this. One more thing I want to do down here where the rocks are, I'm going to add a really dark value, a black right there, to those rocks, right next to the white value of the wave. So something like this. Now I have two white shapes. They are equally white. So I have the white shape of the wave, and I have the white shape of the lighthouse here. They're equally white, just like in my diagram over here, where all of the white shapes are equally white. Looking at my rough sketch here, where does your eye go more than anywhere else? Of course, it goes right here, where this white shape is. And why is that? Well, for the same reason that your eye goes to this white shape in my diagram over here, because of the dark value that surrounds it. And in my sketch here, you can see that that white wave is surrounded by these dark rocks, creating a very strong value contrast within this area right here. But when you look at the white on the lighthouse over here, you can see that the lighthouse is not surrounded by darks that are as dark as these darks that surround the wave. And therefore, the eye is not attracted here to this white as much as it is attracted to this white. Just like what you see here in this diagram. So here you have seen that depending on what value you surround a particular value with will determine whether that value has emphasis. Emphasis meaning that the eye is attracted to that particular shape because of strong value contrast. So here there isn't emphasis, but here there is emphasis because, as I pointed out to you, this white wave is surrounded by darker values than the lighthouse is. So you can control where the viewer is going to look and what shapes are important by what value you surround that white or light shape with. So it just shows you that you can use the same degree of white shapes, the same degree of value in shapes, and still be able to create emphasis, depending on what values you use to surround that particular light shape with. The darker values that surround the light shape will create emphasis, while the lighter values that surround the white or light shapes will not create emphasis. Now this is a very important principle that you should try to work at getting into your paintings. This is how you can control where the viewer is going to look, what is important and what is not so important, what is of secondary importance within the painting. In other words, create a hierarchy of value contrasts. The stronger the value contrast, the more the viewer's eye is going to be attracted to that particular shape. So getting back over here to this diagram, these two white shapes compete for attention because they both have the same degree of value contrast. However, let's say I now add a black that surrounds this white shape. Which shape do you now think the eye is attracted to more? Of course, it's this shape, because this is where the stronger value contrast is. And now this becomes the weaker value contrast. That becomes of secondary importance, whereas before it was the most important shape. Now it is of secondary importance, and this now becomes of greater importance. And this becomes the least important. So you see how you can control the amount of attention a particular shape gets by the degree of value contrast that it has. Now getting back to these two values that compete for attention because they have the same degree of value contrast. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a white cloud over here. So what's happening now? Well, you can see that the cloud now is demanding a certain amount of attention and taking attention away from the lighthouse. The two white shapes are competing for attention, just as these two white shapes here are competing for attention. So, in order for the lighthouse to get more attention, I need to reduce the value on this white cloud. And this is a case where you can't have two shapes that have the same degree of value, because then they're going to be competing for attention. So by reducing the value a little bit like this on the cloud, now you can see that more attention is directed to the lighthouse because there is a greater amount of value contrast here than there is here where the cloud is. This is the simple principle. When you place a white or light shape against a dark background, that light shape will appear even lighter. When you place that light shape against a lighter background, that light shape doesn't appear as light. So it all depends on how dark the background is against which you place that light shape. Now the opposite is true when you have a dark shape. So here's a white background, and when I place this dark shape against the white, this dark shape appears even darker than when it is placed against a darker background like this. This principle is seen here and here. Good paintings have what is called a hierarchy of value contrasts. And what that means is that there are different degrees or strengths of value contrast within a painting. And you can see that in this little rough sketch that I did here. Up to now, I've been focusing on the white shapes, but I want to go a bit further than that and focus on the hierarchy of value contrasts, on establishing different degrees of value contrast within a painting. All good paintings have this hierarchy of value contrasts. If you look over here to this diagram, I'm going to darken this value here somewhat, like this. Now, the value contrast is no longer as strong here as it was before. What I have now is this hierarchy of value contrasts within this diagram. I darkened this value a little bit more, and I think I can darken it even more, just a little bit more. So what I have now is this variety of different degrees of value contrast. So here's a strong value contrast, here's a weaker value contrast, and here's one that is stronger than this value contrast, but not as strong as this value contrast. So I have 1, 2, 3 different degrees of value contrast, thereby establishing a hierarchy of value contrast. Because I have these varying degrees of value contrast over here, the eye is attracted differently to these different value contrasts. It is attracted less here, a bit more here, but mostly here. I made a couple of changes to this sketch here. I added a bit more of this dark value surrounding the lighthouse and darkened this rock in the foreground a bit more. But what I want to point out to you is the hierarchy of value contrasts that have been established within this rough sketch. And this is probably one of the most important lessons in art that you're ever going to learn. Therefore, it's very important that you are able to apply this to your own paintings. If you don't apply this to your own paintings, then what you wind up with is a bunch of objects within your painting that all compete for attention because they all have the same degree of value contrast, and therefore your painting will not have a hierarchy of value contrast. And without a hierarchy of value contrast, you also won't be able to establish a center of interest like I did in this diagram and like I did here in my rough sketch. When you look at my rough sketch here, you can see this variety of different degrees of value contrast. For example, where the sky and the water are, the value differences aren't that great. So therefore, the value contrast is not very strong here. This is a weak value contrast. And then up here where the cloud is, seen against the sky, the strength of the value contrast is somewhat stronger. So already I have two differences. Here's a weaker value contrast. Here's one that's a bit stronger. But then when you look over here where the rock is and the sky, the value contrast is stronger, quite a bit stronger. When you look over here where the white shapes of the lighthouse are, seen against the dark value of the rock, you can see that that value contrast is stronger than this value contrast of the rock seen against the sky. Then when you look over here in the foreground where the dark shape of the rock is and the white shape of the wave, this value contrast is even stronger than this one or that one and that one and this one that I pointed out to you. And that's because you place the strongest value contrast at the center of interest, which, as you know, is this. So I have this variety of different degrees of value contrast. And even over here where this rock is, you can see that that value contrast is not as strong as this value contrast right there, or this value contrast right there. So there is this variety of different degrees of value contrast, thereby establishing this hierarchy of value contrasts. So with this hierarchy of value contrasts, I'm establishing within the painting what is least important, what is more important, and what is most important. That's how you can control the amount of attention that a particular part of the painting is going to receive by how much value contrast or how strong the value contrast is that you give it. So since the sky and the water here is not very important, I gave that part of the painting less strong value contrast. The cloud in the sky is a bit more important, so that has somewhat stronger value contrast. The rock is more important than the cloud, so therefore the rock is given a greater amount of value contrast, while the lighthouse, which is more important than the rock, receives even greater value contrast or stronger value contrast than the rock does. And since the wave is the most important part of the painting, that's where you find the strongest value contrast. And this rock over here isn't that important, so therefore it doesn't receive the same degree of value contrast that this part of the painting has. So where there is less strong value contrast, the eye will be attracted there less than to other parts where the value contrast is stronger. So that's how you can control where the eye of the viewer is going to look and what the viewer is going to find more or less important within a painting. Let's say I decide that I want less attention drawn here where this rock is. All I need to do is just add a lighter value like this, making that dark value a bit lighter, and now that part of the rock attracts less attention. You see how important it is to be able to control the degree of value contrast or the strength of value contrast. And unless you're able to do this, the different parts of your painting are all going to be of equal importance because the value contrasts are all going to be of the same strength. I'm going to give you an example of what to avoid, what a picture looks like when there are too many value contrasts all over the picture of equal strength. And here it is. You can see how strong this value contrast is right there, which is just as strong as this one is right here, and which is just as strong as this one is, and this one right there, the white of the cloud, and then that black shadow. And then, of course, the lighthouse has the same degree of strong contrast of white and black as this does right there. So the eye really doesn't know where the center of interest is because all of these parts of the picture have the same degree of value contrast. There aren't some that are weaker, some that are stronger. They're all equally strong. And so the eye of the viewer just jumps around all over the place and doesn't know where to rest. The eye should come to rest at the center of interest, like in this case here. The eye knows, in this case, what is more important, what is less important, what is least important. But in this example, the eye doesn't know what is less important and what is more important because here everything seems to be of equal importance. So this is something that a beginner might do, or an amateur, and it's something that needs to be avoided. And now, let's say you need some darks in the background here. Right now, I don't have the kind of darks back there that I have in the foreground. Of course, if I do put darks back here, they have to be a bit lighter than these darks in the foreground because of atmospheric perspective, as it's called. Values get lighter as they move further back. But that doesn't mean that I can't have some darks back here, as long as those darks are not as dark as the darks in the foreground. So I can add some darks like this, but the degree of value contrast must not be greater than parts of the painting that are more important, such as where the lighthouse is right here. That contrast between the white value of the lighthouse and the darker value of the rock needs to be greater than this value contrast of the darks that I added with the lighter dark of the rock. So as long as that contrast isn't as strong as this contrast here, I can add these darks to the rock. You can see that even though I've added these darks to the rock, the value contrast isn't so strong that it detracts attention away from the lighthouse. It's the lower part of the lighthouse that attracts the most attention because that's where the stronger value contrast is. When you look at the upper part of the lighthouse right there, the value contrast isn't as strong up there as it is down here. And therefore that upper part of the lighthouse doesn't attract as much attention as this part does. Now there's something else I want to mention which is very important, and that is that you should be aware that the eye moves easily over areas of value contrast that are similar. So therefore, if I, let's say, darken this white shape here, like that, and I darken it even more, and I darken this larger light shape even more, the eye, it moves easily across these value shapes because the value contrast isn't that great. The eye stops for a moment, but it doesn't linger here because the value contrast isn't strong enough. So the eye can easily move from one shape to the other. And because these values are the same, the eye links them up, so to speak, connects them, and therefore moves from one to the next easily, until it gets to a shape where the value contrast is strong, like right there, for example. Then the eye stops. So where you don't want the eye to linger a lot within the painting, make the value contrast weaker, like you see here. And that will then cause the eye to quickly move across those areas where the value contrasts are weaker until it gets to where the value contrast is stronger, like right there. Let's say I want to have the eye of the viewer of my rough sketch here move easily across this area right there. From the ocean to the rock, to the big rock, to the small rock. I don't want the eye to linger here because that area isn't very important. So what I can do is I reduce the degree of value contrast, just like I did over here in the diagram example. And now the values are more closely related, and therefore the eye easily passes over these value contrasts here because they're not very strong, and it doesn't therefore pay much attention to this part of the painting, which it shouldn't because it's not that important. So that's a demonstration of what I showed you here. What I'm showing you in this video is all part of composition. Composition isn't just arranging shapes within the picture area. That's just one part of composition. Composition can be defined as the architecture of picture making, and it includes all of the elements of picture making, which the fundamentals are part of. So if you don't know the elements of picture making, if you don't know the fundamentals, then you're not going to be able to paint these kind of pictures. And much better. This is just a rough sketch. If you want to learn what those elements of picture making are, what the fundamentals are, then you might want to check out my Complete Illustration Art course, which teaches all of these things. I'm only interested in getting right to the heart of what is important in art, what it is exactly that will dramatically improve your drawings and paintings. That's what I focus on. I don't focus on a lot of irrelevant and unnecessary things that aren't really going to improve your art or make you a better artist. I see so many videos in which those things that are of secondary importance are focused on. Things that aren't really going to dramatically improve your work. And that's what I dispense with. Anything that is really not going to dramatically improve your work, I don't focus on. This video just gives you a small sampling of what is really important in art and what it is that will transform your work from an amateur, if you are an amateur, to a professional. Pretty much everything I've shown you here applies also to color. So not only do you have a hierarchy of value contrast, but there's also a hierarchy of color contrasts, which is what you need to also learn about. You need to see what a hierarchy of color contrasts looks like within a painting like this. I won't, however, be able to show you how color is used to create this hierarchy of color contrasts, because that would then make this video run way too long. And if you want to learn about color and all of the elements of picture making and the fundamentals, then you might want to check out my Complete Illustration Art course. Now I want to give you another example of what I've been showing you, and here is a similar diagram to the one that I showed you previously, in which I established varying degrees of value contrast. You can see that right here is where the strongest value contrast is. Then right here is the second strongest value contrast. And this is where the third strongest value contrast is. So I've established a hierarchy of value contrasts here, just as I did in the previous example. Like in the previous example, I'm going to do another rough sketch for you that demonstrates this hierarchy of value contrasts. And specifically, I'll emphasize where the center of interest is, just like I did before in the other example. It's always important for an art student to be able to see more than just one example, because the more examples you see of what is being taught, the better your understanding of that is going to be. We'll start off by establishing this format shape, as it's called, into which I'll do the drawing. Always decide on what the format shape is going to be for your drawing. And the subject is going to be these two guys in a rowboat, and they're trying to navigate past these dead tree trunks that are sticking out of the water. If they hit one of these dead tree trunks, there's a danger of the boat sinking. So each of these guys has a paddle, and they're trying to navigate past those tree trunks back here. I think I'll put a riverbank, and on that riverbank there are trees like this moving toward the right. Then right here I'm going to add a tree like this, stopping the eye from moving out of the picture at the right. The boat is moving toward the right, so if there wasn't something here to stop the eye from moving in the direction that the boat is moving and in the direction that these trees are moving, the viewer's eye would leave the picture area. So this is called a stopper, whenever you introduce something that will stop the eye of the viewer from leaving the picture area. And then down here I'm also going to add a dead tree trunk coming out of the water. I'm also thinking about what the underlying structure should be, or as it's also referred to, the framework of the picture, or armature. And if you don't know about the underlying structure, this is something that you need to learn. All really good pictures have an underlying structure that supports the subject matter, that supports all the shapes and values and forms. The underlying structure, or armature, or framework structure, holds up everything, supports everything, like the foundation on a house. And right here on this dead tree, I think I'm going to add this bird sitting there, looking up in the direction of where these two guys are in the boat. So I'm going to jump ahead and show you a more finished version of this really rough sketch that I have here. I think I'll add one more dead tree coming out of the water right there. Another obstacle. Here I'm starting off with just showing you this rough line work sketch. Later I'll show you a more finished version of the rough sketch. But I need to start this way. What I'm going to do now is add a tone over the whole area here, over this entire picture area. This is a very important lesson on learning to establish a hierarchy of different value contrasts. So what I'm going to do now is add a darker tone to some of these objects, some of these shapes, like this one here in the foreground. this dead tree, and then also on the boat, and then maybe back here where these trees are, and then on this tree on the right side over there also, and on this figure here in the boat, a darker tone. So something like this. Because everything in this picture is in a medium tone or tones, they are too closely related. And because these tones are too closely related, too similar in values, there's nothing that stands out any more than anything else. I'm going to lighten those tones so there's something like this. Then come over to the color picker and let's say select a dark tone and add that dark tone over here, back there where those trees are located. And let's say I add the dark tone here as well. I think I'm going to eliminate that dark tone right there. It's a little too large. I think that's better. The shadow being cast by the boat, but it's not cast that far away from the boat. It's a little too far away. I think that works better. And now I'll continue adding that dark tone right here on this tree trunk that's sticking out of the water. Also, there's a tree over here on the right side that I'll add that dark tone to. And then I'll add a dark tone here in the lower right corner, like this. I think I'll add an even darker tone to this foreground tree trunk right there, like that. And then maybe a darker tone on the tree trunk on the right side as well. And let's say I add a dark tone on the figure in the boat, the foreground figure, like that. By using different tones, we can easily make things contrast with one another. However, in this example, everything seems equally important. The trees in the distance, the boat, and the foreground tree trunks. They all command the same amount of attention. The values are not helping to create a definite center of interest, which is what values need to do. I'm going to change the value of the water from this really light gray to more of a darker gray, something like that maybe. And by doing that, by darkening the tone of the water, I'm now reducing the value contrasts. They are no longer as strong as they were before when there was a lighter value on the water. So by using in-between values of gray, as I'm doing here, I can control the contrast between the tones. And what's happening now is that a center of interest has been established through value contrast, and if you look over here, you can see that the eye is attracted to that light value on this figure here because of the stronger value contrasts that exist here. There's a dark value on the foreground figure, while this figure has that lighter value, and this middle value has been placed on the water, and therefore this area here has more value contrast, stronger value contrast than anywhere else. So you see the eye being drawn here. Now I can strengthen the center of interest by darkening the value of the foreground figure that already has a dark value, and I'll make that value even darker. You see a very dark value against a very light value. And if you want to attract attention to the center of interest, place your darkest dark next to your lightest light. Even though in this case this dark value is the same dark value that you find here on this tree trunk and that one, the eye is still attracted to this area more so because here is where I place this lightest value against this dark value, therefore creating a strong value contrast right here, which is the center of interest. While in the other parts of the picture, here and here and here and the boat, the attention isn't drawn to those parts as much as it is to this area, because in those other parts the value contrast isn't as strong as it is right here. So therefore these other parts of the picture become less important because the value contrast isn't as strong, and this part of the picture becomes more important because the value contrast is the strongest here, and therefore this part of the picture establishes the center of interest. I'm showing you here that by controlling the amount of value contrast within different parts of the painting, you can establish what is more important or what is less important, depending on the degree of value contrast that you apply. Even though the value contrast has been reduced in other parts of the picture, such as where this tree trunk is and those background trees and the boat and this tree here, those elements still read clearly. The value contrast hasn't been made in those other parts so that there is almost no value contrast, which would then cause those elements to not read clearly, because there wouldn't be enough value contrast if I, for example, added this light value onto the foreground tree here, like this. Then that foreground tree wouldn't read clearly anymore because it no longer has that dark light value contrast that makes it stand out. Now the tree trunk here is too much the same value as the water, and therefore the tree trunk doesn't read clearly. There has to be enough value contrast in order for a shape to read clearly, to stand out, so that you can make out what it is. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to make the dark value here on this foreground figure even darker, thereby establishing the darkest dark on this figure placed next to the lightest light. And that's how you create the strongest value contrast within a picture, and that strongest value contrast, the darkest dark against the lightest light, should be placed on the center of interest in order for the center of interest to become a kind of bullseye that draws the eye of the viewer to it. And you can see that that dark is slightly darker than the dark on the tree here and here. And therefore, this is where the strongest value contrast occurs. What I'm going to do is finish up this rough sketch, but I won't be able to show you how I do that because that would take too long. So once I've finished it, I'm going to then jump ahead and show you the finished rough black and white sketch. Here's the rough sketch carried somewhat further to a more finished looking state, and what I'm going to do is darken the foreground a little bit more like this, thereby reducing the value contrast between this foreground tree trunk and the water, and therefore attracting even less attention to that particular part of the picture. And then the value gets lighter as it moves further up and further back, thereby creating a gradation of tone, which helps to add interest to the painting. You can see that the boat reads clearly against the darker tone of the water, and right here, as I pointed out to you earlier, this is where the strongest value contrast occurs. The darkest dark against the lightest light. And you have what is called alternation of values, which you'll learn about in my course. Very important principle of design. And I'll just briefly point something out to you where that occurs. You see a dark value here, then you see a light value here, then it changes back, it alternates to a dark value, and then again to a lighter value. So within this area right here, there is this alternation of values from dark to light to dark to light again. And that adds a kind of pulse or rhythm through alternation of values to the painting. And also this kind of alternation of dark against light, light against dark helps you in establishing forms or shapes that read clearly one against the other. So you see this gradation of value or tone from dark moving up to the lighter value back here, and over on this side from dark to lighter value to an even lighter value. So there's this gradation of values, which again is another important principle of design that you need to learn about and apply to your paintings. These are all things that you'll be learning more about in my course. If you're interested in taking it, you'll be learning all of the things that you really need to know to produce the very best paintings and drawings that you can possibly do. What I think I'm going to do is add a little more dark value here like this. I think it needs that. And a dark value right there underneath the boat. Reflection of the boat in the water. I think that works better. What I think the painting needs is a lighter value up here so that the figures stand out even more. And also over here on the other side, that needs to be made lighter as well. And by making this part of the painting lighter, the figure that has this dark value then stands out better against the background of the water. This is where your ability to make correct value judgments comes in. And this is not easy to achieve. In time, with a lot of practice, you'll get better and better at judging the correct values that you need to put into a painting. You can see the different degrees of value contrast, establishing that hierarchy of value contrast that I talked about in the previous example. And here in the foreground, for example, where the tree trunk is, that tree trunk is lost a little bit too much against the dark value of the water. And I want that tree trunk to stand out a little bit more, so what I need to do is lighten that dark value of the water a little bit like this, which will then make that tree trunk read more clearly or stand out better. But I don't want it to stand out so much that it becomes too important and then competes with the figures on the boat. And I think that works better now. The tree trunk reads more clearly because of the stronger value contrast, but the value contrast isn't so strong here that it detracts attention away from where the center of interest is, which is where these figures are. And that contrast there is still stronger than this value contrast here. And now what I'm going to do is darken this part of the water a little bit more so that the boat stands out better against the water. And I'm also darkening the edge here where the riverbank is, right there, because this part of the painting isn't that important, so therefore I'm not creating a strong value contrast here. The stronger value contrast should be situated in the vicinity of where the center of interest is. That is, more toward the inside of the picture and not at the periphery of a picture. That is, the outer limits of a picture toward the border within this part of the picture. Don't place your strongest value contrasts here, because if you do that, it will draw the eye of the viewer toward the borders of the picture and out of the picture. So keep your strongest value contrasts within the picture, right around here, and not out here toward the borders, as I mentioned. And specifically, those strongest value contrasts, as I've been showing you, should be centered around the center of interest, within that area where the center of interest is. Just as in the previous example, there are these different degrees of value contrast within this picture, creating this hierarchy of value contrasts, and the amount of value contrast that is given to a particular part of the picture, as I've been pointing out to you, determines how important that particular part of the picture is. This part of the picture is not as important as this part is. This part is important because it helps to identify the boat. It makes the boat stand out against the water. So there needs to be more of a value contrast here. This part right there is not that important, so therefore there isn't a very strong value contrast here between the water and the river bank. And then where the trees are right there, the value contrast is very low here because that part of the painting shouldn't attract a lot of attention, because if the value contrasts were very strong here, something like this, the eye of the viewer would be attracted here too much. You see how this now detracts from the center of interest. It's taking attention away from the center of interest too much. And of course it leads your eye right out of the picture area. This is what I mentioned before, that you shouldn't place strong value contrasts at the periphery of a picture or at the borders like this. Then this part of the picture isn't all that important, therefore the value contrast isn't as strong here. Now here where this tree trunk is, you can see that there is a greater amount of value contrast here than here. This tree trunk is important because it helps to stop the eye from moving out of the picture at the right border. The boat sets up what is called an implied line. The eye follows the direction in which the boat is moving, and it's moving toward the right, and the eye would keep on moving if it weren't for this tree trunk here, which stops the eye. Now when you look over here where the riverbank is, you can see that there is a sharper edge here, or greater value contrast, than there is over here. And because of that, the eye is attracted to this part of the riverbank, and therefore attracted to the center of interest here as well. I placed the stronger value contrast near the center of interest to help draw attention to the center of interest. Here you can see that I brought back that previous example in which I pointed out to you the hierarchy of value contrasts, which this rough sketch also contains, as I've been showing you, and you can compare the two examples. So this is something that is very important, that needs to be applied to a painting. Otherwise, everything is going to be competing for attention. You need that hierarchy of different degrees of value contrast. Now, it's a matter of being able to judge correctly as to what the value should be that is placed next to another value. And this sort of thing is not that easy to achieve. Therefore, it will take a lot of practice on your part, trying to consciously apply what you've learned in this video to your own paintings. You have to keep at it until you get it. It's just a matter of time, and you'll be able to paint pictures that have these varying degrees of value contrast that create this hierarchy that is so important to the success of a painting. If you want to paint great pictures, there is, of course, a lot more to be learned than what I've shown you here. If you want to learn all about picture making and what the elements of picture making are and the fundamentals, then check out my complete illustration art course. It's unlike any you're going to find anywhere else, because I get right to the heart of what is important in art. I dispense with all of those superfluous, unnecessary, secondary things that so many of these art videos talk about that aren't really going to make better pictures for you. You need to know what is really important, and that is what is going to transform your beginner's work into more professional looking work. And that's what I teach. I teach those core fundamentals, those things that are really important, that will transform your work from beginner to professional. If you want to become a really good artist, or even a great artist, then it's going to take a lot of hard work on your part. And if you're not willing to put in that hard work, then you're not going to become that really good or great artist. It's as simple as that. It takes a lot of hard work. What you need to do is try to consciously get these things that you're learning about into practice work. A lot of practice work. The more practice work that you do, in which you try to consciously apply what you've learned, the better your work is going to become. Now, it's not easy to recall everything that you've learned within a video. So you have to watch the video again and again and again until you recall more and more of what you've learned. Or you watch the video, you learn a little bit from it, then you go to the practice work and you try to apply that little bit that you've watched in the video to the practice work. Then you move on and you learn a little bit more of what the video has to teach, and then in your next practice work you try to get that into your practice work as well. So each time you do your practice work, you try to get a little more of what you've learned in the video into your practice work. And then in time, you're going to be able to get all of what you've learned in that video into your practice work. And that's when you're going to see a really dramatic improvement in your work. But you're going to see gradual improvements in your work if you try to apply a little bit of what you learned in the video at a time to your practice work. Don't try to do too much at once. You have to go through this process of evolution from beginner to accomplished artist. You don't jump from beginner to accomplished artist in one step. A lot of steps are involved, and you have to be willing to travel that hard road. And not everyone is willing to travel that hard road. Many are looking for some kind of secrets that are going to transform them almost overnight from beginner to great artist. And that is just a fantasy. It will never happen. It just doesn't work that way. And now it's time to end this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching it, and that you will try to apply what I've shown you in this video. And it's going to make a big difference in your work when you're able to do that. Now it's time to say goodbye and good luck to you.